You open this door with the key of reason. Beyond it is another dimension, a dimension of truth, a dimension of freedom, a dimension of joy. You're moving into the land of both the ideal and the real, of the possible and the actual. You've just crossed over into the Capitalist Corner.
Where reason meets reality, welcome to the Capitalist Corner.
Welcome, everyone, to this special episode of the Capitalist Corner. Joining me today is Juan Fernando Carpio. He is a student of, an advocate of free market economics and freedom in politics. He's also an author. He and I today will be debating the proposition that I will be defending. I will be arguing that Ayn Rand is superior to Murray Rothbard when it comes to advocating individual rights. I believe that this debate stemmed from a post I made where I said that treating self-ownership as an axiom is one of the worst ideas to come out of the libertarian movement. Is that right, Juan? Is that the post that got you in it? Okay. So the way we're going to do this is we're each going to get 10 minutes to open and then 5 minutes each to respond. I'll start and I'll allow you, Juan, you can get the last word when we do our closing statements. Is that fair for you? Okay.
Perfect.
I just special thanks to Juan for joining us here today. I think we're going to have a fun debate. Hopefully we all learn something. So when we're talking about rights, it's important to understand that right is a moral concept. It's literally traditionally been defined as a moral claim or a just claim, and just itself is, of course, a moral concept. Now, Rothbard uses the terms rights, values, ethics, morality, but he doesn't defend any of them. He doesn't define any of them himself. He does supply a definition of rights from somebody else, and that definition is when we say that one has the right to do certain things, we mean this and only this, that it would be immoral for another, alone or in combination, to stop that person, stop him from doing this by force or the threat thereof. Now, right away, I see a problem with this definition because it doesn't tell me what I can do, or it doesn't even imply what I can do if somebody violates this right. Because people do immoral things to me all the time. There's something different when physical force is involved. For instance, I would be moral to respond very differently if somebody jumped on me and attempted to steal my wallet than if I would if they simply called me a name or lied to me. Now, the concept of ownership has traditionally meant a right to property. Now, Rothbard says that we have a absolute right to self-ownership, but all this tells us is that we have a right to a right. If ownership is a right and I have a right to that right, then it seems to me like you're just not connecting to reality. And certainly he never attempts to connect right to a broader moral theory. In fact, he treats his foundational concepts as axioms. He even seems to treat self-ownership as equivalent to free will. He writes, for instance, he, meaning a human being, also discovers the natural fact of his mind's command over his body and its actions. That is, of his natural ownership of his self. But simply saying that I have control over myself or control over something else does not entail ownership. Not if ownership is a right. You actually have to demonstrate that you have this right. He asserts that self-ownership, non-aggression, and life as a value are all axiomatic. But axioms, or what is axiomatic, means self-evident. It's that which is so obvious it doesn't require proof, and it's that which you can build a system upon. But if you're asserting self-ownership as an axiom, which is more of a interpersonal idea, you're divorcing it already from a larger moral theory. So how then can a right be a moral claim, which is what it is? And in order to try to demonstrate that these are axioms, on one hand, he at times appeals to general agreement. At another time, he says, quote, there are very few people who would deny the injustice of taking somebody's property, but who cares what people agree to? That's not proving anything other than that this is a social custom. He also says that an axiom is demonstrated when arguing against it would be a contradiction, but that's clearly not the term here. I can argue against self-ownership and won't be in a contradiction unless you can demonstrate that self-ownership is a fact. I similarly can argue that life is not a value and that aggression, there's nothing wrong with it, without contradicting myself. These are things that need to be proven. They're not, again, axiomatic. Then, of course, Rothbard comes with what's been called the trichotomy, where he says either we own ourselves, everybody owns everybody, or some people own other people. He forgets the option that nobody owns anyone or that nobody owns anything. If ownership entails rights, then if there's no objective morality, for instance, then there's no objective rights and there's no objective sense of ownership. If there's no objective sense of ownership, then his trichotomy collapses. It's just not true that either we own ourselves or somebody else owns us or we own, everybody else. Now, the idea from these axioms, Rothbard says that property relations can all be deduced. Just start with these axioms and you can deduce property relations. Now, the idea of his moral views being axiomatic leads to an intrinsicist viewpoint on morality. That means that things are right in themselves. And for instance, Rothbard asks rhetorically, may there not be something about an act in itself which in its very nature can be considered good or evil? No. You're divorcing actions from consequences, much in the way as Immanuel Kant does in his duty ethics. You're saying that things can be good or bad, irrespective of consequences. But by severing moral actions from consequences, we end up, for instance, with a contemporary libertarian saying recently that he would not violate the NAP by stealing a penny if it would save the whole world. And of course, why would he? If the ethical thing to do, if you have a duty to never violate this axiom, then of course that would be the case. You also, of course, you have Rothbard advocating for the upending of all property relations that can't be traced back to proper ownership, or rather being willing to upend whatever property relations can be shown not to trace back to property ownership, meaning they weren't homesteaded and then leading into a direct line to the person that owns them today. So you just don't care about the chaos this would cause, about the suffering, the rights violations that would take place in fact while that's happening. And it's my view that this is how Rothbard arrives at anarchy. You start off with a claimed axiom, you deduce from there in a straight rationalist line all the way to anarchy, and your ideas and concepts never touch the ground. They're never grounded in reality. They're just grounded in his asserted axioms. So now let's take Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand starts not with self-ownership, not even with ethics. She starts with metaphysics, that reality is what it is. She then has a complete epistemological framework that demonstrates how to form concepts, how to gain knowledge. So you already have all this in line by the time you get to ethics. And when we get to ethics, unlike Rothbard, we have a definition. Ethics is a code of values to guide man's choices and action, the choices and actions that determine the purpose and the course of his life. Now, value, what is value? She equates value with good. She then defines value as that which one acts to gain and or keep. And importantly, the means by which we are to measure this is with life as the standard of value. Now, my point here isn't to give an entire lecture on Randian philosophy or Randian ethics, just to show that she does these things before she ever gets to rights. So then she elucidates what she calls the three fundamental values: reason, purpose, self-esteem, and virtues. The virtues are the means by which you get values. These are productiveness, honesty, independence, justice, integrity, and pride. These are the appropriate methods you are to use to get what you want in this world. They're the principles you are to live by. And from that, she shows that the initiation of force is evil because it contradicts your former virtues and values. And importantly, whereas Rothbard held that violating somebody else's self-ownership is wrong because of what it does to them, but he never has a connecting link, Rand shows that to initiate force against another person is harmful to you, that it's not in your interest to do so. So it falls in line with her ethic, which is rational egoism. So now, before we ever even get to politics, she shows that it's wrong to initiate force. Then we get to rights. Now, a right, she says, is a moral principle, which is absolutely correct, and it defines and sanctions a man's freedom of action in a social context. It's what actions do I have a right to take? And she ties this back to life as the standard of value. I must have the right to do those things, a moral claim, to act ethically, to do those things that I judge are in my own interest. And importantly, as she argues later on, not in the definition, what this ultimately breaks down to, although she doesn't use this language, is the right to self-defense. If somebody violates my rights, I have the right to defend myself or the right to retaliate. Now, that's just, we're not getting into any broad political systems, political views, nothing. That is just the case that she makes for rights. I insist and assert that it's far better than Rothbard's because it's far more complete and it's not based on arbitrary axioms. And with that, I will turn it over to my admiral opponent, Mr. Juan Fernando Carpio.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so first of all, let me correct you on the appreciation or summary that you made about Rothbardian ethics. That's the name of the article by Hoppe, actually, and it refers to who chooses. One chooses one, and his committee, let's say, or one or his and his team chooses for all, or everyone chooses for everyone. Like an assembly mode, or everyone chooses for themselves. Those are the three choices, but it has nothing to do with property of bodies. So actually, we have a huge void, for example, in economic science about the body as a capital good. I gave a talk on the subject, by the way, and there's a void, but we can go on into that later. And there's the problem of the body, even in economics. So, and I think Stefan Kinsella has a better Rothbardian or a Rothbardian application because of course Rothbard's students tend to be, if I may, more audacious or let's say natural about criticizing. It's not a closed system, etc., etc. No pun intended or pun intended. So what's the problem here is that even in the Garden of Eden, where we have superabundance of goods, we would have scarcity of body and time because your body and attention have competing rival uses, right? Like maybe you want to go play tennis, but someone wants to hug you at the same time. There are competing uses. So you need ultimate control over scarce resources. And of course, self-property is not the same exactly as property of other goods that you can alienate and just sell, basically. And again, here I have to mention Stefan Kinsella because he makes not only a description of how we come to own ourselves, which is the first thing I wanted to mention him on, but the second one is that not all things that we can sell are property, and not all things that are property we can sell. There's this quick, we love these quick slogans and mantras, and followers of Ayn Rand are as guilty of this as much as anyone, or even more. But we love these quick responses to things, these things that sound so clever and uncontestable, but but the real life is full of nuances. So what happens in real life, or what really happened historically, is that property evolved culturally or was invented in many places or the whole world, because it's not like we asked John Locke or Ayn Rand or Thomas Jefferson, hey, how do we property? It emerged everywhere, basically, past some point, past Dunbar's number. After Dunbar's number, this is anthropology, Robin Dunbar found out that we evolved, our brain evolved, and this is why we have to explain these things. This is why we have Rothbard and Rands to begin with, because these things are not obvious. These things about, the commercial world and respecting property rights and the role of private enterprise, some of us take it for granted, but it's not so, because our brain evolved. We have the brain of basically the same brain we had, 100,000 years ago, or 40,000, or 10,000 years ago, which means we evolved for communities that are under 200 individuals on the average, which means our brain can handle around 150. That's Dunbar's number in anthropology. Past Dunbar's number, we need what Karl Menger, the founder or the pioneer of the Austrian school, the so-called Austrian school, um, discovered or set forth, is that these institutions evolve. Basically, they have all evolved everywhere. There's money, ways of, forms of money, different money, because we tend to think of money as something portable. No, there's non-portable money, or monetary inventions in many places. And there's no, it has to be metal, no grains, or no, it has to be dead, no, the animals have been used as money. So money and property have evolved. This is an anthropological evolutionary point, and it minimizes conflicts. It allows for long-term planning, and you don't need any more theory, except that the fact that genetically we have evolved to thrive. The purpose of life in terms of strict biology, which is of course not our point of view, not yours or mine, but strictly from the biological point of view, we're about survival and replication. All the rest we have been extracting. This is the perfect metaphor from Mother Nature, and we have extended our lives. You're giving an extra meaning, whatever. But think about our ancestors 400,000 years ago. And this, I find Randians very at odds with science when it doesn't suit them. They're all for reason somehow, but they're not up to date with evolutionary psychology and just evolutionary science in general, and neo-Darwinism, etc., etc. So property ownership ends. Let me please correct you on this. After sometimes in all legal systems, all legal systems evolve, and most notably the common law and the Roman law, and all of these systems, by the way, getting into politics myself right away, in systems of free judges, in competing systems of judges, not generally, or no state, or the state was separated from the production of law, like in ancient Rome. So again, there was no this idea that republics. Let me tell you this, as a Latin American, and I was listening to your other podcasts before connecting with you today. So let me tell you that you guys talk about, I don't know, like mankind as if some things are going to ever be repeated again, like a classical liberal era. Let me tell you, as a Latin American, I wanted to bring this something new to your space. Is that I don't trust your idea of a republic, and I think it's very it's funny when you say never grounded in reality, things like that, never grounded in reality, because actually Rothbard and Hoppe's ideas have grounding in ancient systems of judges, and or monarchs, or even Greece. We admire Greece so much, but it was decentralized, strictly not decentralized, broken, fragmented, never centralized to begin with, system of 1,500 cities or small kingdoms. That was Greece, and it produced more geniuses in 200 years than Europe in the next 2,000 years. So all these things, the Rothbardian ideas actually have grounding in real life. I don't believe in this Randian fantasy. I mean, I love lots of her ideas. I'm a promoter of her ideas to some degree, but some things are pure fantasy. Even the US government was never, this night watchman state. Politicians, Michael, are always doing things behind your back. This is something both Randians and Rothbardians, like Randians and libertarians, need to learn from cypherpunks and all these people that are behind Bitcoin and all these new things. They don't focus on only property taxes, inflation, which are very important. Don't get me wrong, but it's all about opacity. About power is about opacity and working behind people's backs. You cannot control that with rational ideas or Ayn Rand books. That's not going to happen. How many people do you need for critical mass? And how many people as a percentage of population are going to be rational in that sense, even if that was the way forward, which is not. So um, these ideas that, first of all, it's a closed system. This is reason. This is rational. The rest are not rational. First of all, uh, it's silly. It's kind of anti-reason. Second of all, we need to catch up with evolutionary science and anthropology. Third of all, we have invented these things as money, not because it represents morality, but money evolved as a tool, and we know we can infer some philosophical values from it, but it has been more, let's say, I don't want to say irrational, but pre-rational, that people do some things. As I said, our brain is the same as 400,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. And we have evolved institutions. This is the point of Karl Menger and the Austrian school. We have evolved institutions and systems like markets that are smarter than us, even than the smarter and the smartest among us. Markets are smarter than Ayn Rand. Markets are smarter than Murray Rothbard. Markets are smarter than Ludwig von Mises, in the sense that we have created these emergent properties or institutions that coordinate in ways that we cannot plan on design. Otherwise, socialism would work. And not only socialism, Michael, let me tell you, even this is Rothbard's brilliant example. Let's say a company, let's say Microsoft, goes to an island and takes away every facet of production, and they want to do everything inside, like production of food and schooling, everything inside, like a small country. It will run into the same problems of socialism, because you lack prices. You don't have prices for accounting. You don't know if you're creating value or subtracting value. By the way, values are not things. I don't know why you guys keep talking about values. This is a value. There's no, humans exist and they value or evaluate between choices. And also value, of course, is not objective. It's subjective in the sense that the human psyche is unique. Everyone, you're unique. You're a unique individual. You will never be repeated for good and for bad. And the same goes for me. We have a unique psyche or human soul, in the sense of psyche, of the contents of our psychology, very rich, enriched by arts and by ideas, more and more, etc., etc. But we are unique and irrepeatable. So value is subjective appreciation in that sense, plus it's like an equation. Let's say not an equation, but actually plus scarcity or relative scarcity of alternatives, or equivalent, replaceable alternatives. Like one car is not the same as the other, but if it serves the same function, then you have marginal utility, Menger, all these things. So that is basically my point, is that all these things that Randians think that come from philosophy, of course, have emerged as philosophy too, but most people are participating of systems that are beyond themselves, and that's okay. We just need to not destroy them and focus on the fundamentals that are actually intuitive and instinctive to everyone, in the sense that most people's morality is not stealing someone else's things. And we see some connection between effort. I'm not going to take my neighbor's apples because I wasn't there for 6 months. He was taking care of the trees, etc., etc. But then again, there's another Randian mistake: the idea of creation as the source of property. That makes no sense at all. It's just homesteading. You have names in this. Like, we really need to be more humble, less, ivory tower philosophers in a way, and listen to what has evolved in legal systems. The law has evolved to speak of homesteading because it's a first occupant and who was there first, etc., etc. But we don't need to complicate it so much that it makes sense or actually disconnects from what law has evolved on. We have people. I mean, the judges, systems of judges, either as free judges, as I mentioned, or as bureaucrats of the state, which is I don't know why you prefer a government monopoly of these things and the production of law, especially. It's absurd. That won't produce objective law. Never has. The public choice theory
Okay.
people
Juan?
explain that.
Juan.
But just to finish the idea, yeah. you will never get that. You're better served by competition, like in everything.
Okay. So I just want to remind Juan and remind the audience that the debate proposition was Ayn Rand is superior to Rothbard when it comes to advocating for rights. As such, I don't really care what Hoppe said about rights, and I certainly don't care here what Kinsella said about rights. I also don't care how Rand students view evolution. The proposition has to do with who better advocates for rights. And I just want to quote from Rothbard to clear something up quickly on whether I misrepresented the trichotomy. Rothbard writes, let's set aside for a moment the corollary but more complete case of tangible property and concentrate on the question of a man's ownership rights to his own body. Here, there are two alternatives. Either we may lay down a rule that each man should be permitted to have the right to full ownership of his body, or we may rule that he may not have such complete ownership. If he does, then we have the libertarian natural law for a free society, as treated above. But if he does not, if each man is not entitled to full and 100% self-ownership, then what does this imply? It implies either one of two conditions. One, the communist one of universal and equal other ownership, or two, partial ownership of one group by another. It clearly in the trichotomy refers to self-ownership. Now, you talk about that there's different property types, so self-ownership means something differently. Well, then I don't know what the point of using self-ownership would be, especially because Rothbard uses that to then say that all rights are property rights. You also talk about how systems, well, you said too that things are not obvious, but that goes contrary to Rothbard's claim of things being self-evident, like self-ownership, non-aggression axiom. The fact that systems have evolved, okay, I mean, I know that. I'm a student of Austrian economics. I like Hayek to an extent, but that has nothing to do with proving the case that there are objective rights, which was Rothbard's intent. Rothbard intended to show that there are objective values. You are saying there's not, which, okay, if you want to make the argument contra Rothbard while you're supposed to be defending Rothbard and come out and say that there's no such thing as objective value, well, that'd be a bit strange to me. I don't know, like you got into some things about ancient law and what's better law, you know, is evolved law better than man-made law? You also say that value is not a noun, but you can go back as far as you want. And the concept of value is treated in multiple ways. One in the sense of what I value this, which is an evaluation, but also value, meaning it's good. And what a person values, his values. So, you know, this might be a value of mine. It's a concrete item. It becomes a value by means of whether it's good for me or not good for me and whether I evaluate it as such. And the idea that you talked about creation, it's interested me in a debate about Rothbard's views, because Rothbard literally talked about property coming into being by creation in the metaphor of the sculpture, when he says that he said, leaving aside the origins of the clay and the materials, we clearly would say that the person who creates the sculpture has a right to the sculpture. So even Rothbard talks about these things coming into being. It sounds to me more like you're making the arguments of Stefan Kinsella and defending him rather than defending Rothbard, which I'd be fine to do. I'd be fine to argue about that. I'd be more than happy to argue at another point in time about anarchy versus a limited government, which is more feasible. But the point of this debate is who is better on rights, Rand or Rothbard. And it stemmed from me saying that treating self-ownership as axiomatic was a mistake. But you seem to agree, because self-ownership entails a right. Rothbard says an absolute right. If you don't have objective values, you don't have absolute rights. So I'm really kind of confused and at a loss as to what proposition you're actually, or your point of view you're arguing for, Juan. I don't need my whole 5 minutes. I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Michael. Well, okay. The thing is, I wanted to put some things or set some things forward. in case we need them, and also just because they are all connected in my view. But here's my point. In sum, Rothbard is better than Rand because of people like Hoppe and Kinsella. Where are the Hoppers and Kinsellas of Ayn Rand? You guys do a fantastic job, by the way, and enthusiastic and everything. It's commendable. But of repeating what Ayn Rand said about this and that, is it a closed system? Is David Kelly right or not? I don't know. So yes, Rothbard used these ideas about creation, and let's get on the meat of the subject, which is rights. And because he was on a Randian phase when he wrote those things, and I think he outgrew his Randian phase. That is the whole point of this. Otherwise, Rothbard would be someone on the circle of people that were, according to some people, brownbeat, and according to some other people, just reasoned into. Depends if you believe Rothbard or Riesman. This, but I know I have had Randian or objectivist friends here in Quito, Ecuador, and they are so intense and they want to hit you with reason in the head, and that's not how it works. That's not how you're going to get critical mass to get again a Randian or a small R Republican or classical liberal elite to have this small government you guys fantasize about. It's not going to happen. Never has happened, actually. And the point is that Rothbard is better, so much so that he told Hoppe that Hoppe's defense of what he tried to do with natural rights, deriving an is from an ought, or an ought from an is, actually. His defense, argumentation ethics was better than his. Basically, Rothbard says, okay, my students surpassed me on this, so that's a Rothbardian product too. I think Rothbard fostered a more intellectually curious and audacious by nature environment around himself, and these thinkers like Hoppe and Kinsella, just to name a couple, actually, represent why Rothbard was and is better. It's because he provides some fundamentals where people can actually debate, and maybe you can take some things from Rand, the best of her. But if I say the best of her, Randians are going to be like, no, what do you mean? Everything in here is amazing. No thinker works that way, and reason doesn't work that way. It's impossible. Plus, why was she angry all the time? Who's the joyous libertarian? Probably Rothbard. So he was better also in joy of life and sense of life, apparently. So the problem is, when Rothbard was using these metaphors about creation, he was in his adolescent or teenager phase. We have all had our, ultra Randian or kind of too Randian phase, in my view. But Rothbard was not pro IP. He was at least hesitant on that. So intellectual property is another way where you can see that the Rothbardian, Hoppian, Kinsellian tradition, or the Rothbardian tradition in general, is way better because you're not using this absurd pro-corporation or corporation-induced censorship. That's all that intellectual property is. That's all that it is. I know it. I know the discourse. I know the poetry. It's recognition, the recognition of man's unique ability to create, and blah blah blah. Otherwise, how would people live from their creations through sales? You need to sell things. You cannot go and get up. Just the origin of patents and so-called intellectual property is monarchical and monarchic. So it's the whole thing is a state privilege. Think of freedom like this, Michael. Anything that wouldn't exist in a small town with 1,000 people is probably not only fluff, but it's already destroying or conspiring to, it's a small conspiracy against the public to take advantage of some part of the population. I'm not saying that we should stay in populations of 1,000 people, by the way, of course. What I'm saying is that as an exercise of imagination, if something doesn't exist, like in a small town of 1,000 people, you probably wouldn't have you wouldn't have a patent office, but you wouldn't have, I don't know, of course, a ministry of finance. 2 or 3 people can do that, or maybe it's automated. Plus, we're innovating now, so lots of things that required state or politicians supposedly to take care of us. Now we're gonna do it more transparently or through technology or ourselves, etc. So the point here is, intellectual property is just a privilege for corporations it has never been anything else. It doesn't protect the authors as much as it forbids fans and followers and emulators and etc. And if an artistic master is such a master, then how can someone emulate him? And if they do actually achieve the same or surpass him, the better for humanity. But basically, so-called intellectual property violates real property rights. And it's that way you need big states and overreaching governments. Let's even go from the minarchistic point of view. Overreaching governments that have exceeded their functions in order to have this so-called intellectual property. But these experiments of freedom, by the way, 900 years in Ireland, 300
Juan,
years in Iceland, and
Juan, you're over your
other
5
experiments.
minutes.
Okay, thank you, Michael. All these experiments have never evolved such an aberration as so-called intellectual property, which is anti-rights and anti-human, anti-reason, and anti-market.
Okay. So again, the proposition is that Ayn Rand is better than Rothbard on rights, on her defense of rights, specifically stemming from my observation that the treatment of self-ownership as an axiom was a bad idea. But you now seem to concede it's a bad idea. You're saying, well, Rothbard was in his childish phase. Rothbard wrote that in The Ethics of Liberty, I think in 1983 that was published, maybe 81, maybe I'm confused. Either way, he was, I believe, in his 50s when he wrote that. He was well out of his Randian phase. But again, we're here to talk about who's better at making the case for rights. We're not here to talk about who was better overall. We're not here to talk about who was happier or who was angry. We're not here to talk about who had better students or whose students have done more afterwards. We're not here to talk about how objectivists in Ecuador have treated you. We're here to talk about who made the better case for rights. But it seems crystal clear to me that you don't believe there's objective rights. On that basis, I don't even understand how you're going to oppose intellectual property. Now, I'm a supporter of intellectual property, but I believe that there's intellectual property rights. But you don't even believe there can be objective rights. And it doesn't matter if you go into how law evolved in Ireland. You could bring in Iceland, you can bring in Acadia, and every other supposed anarchist utopia that's existed, but none of them really were. You say, well, the limited state that Rand advocates has never existed. Well, the system of competing defense agencies over in the same geographical area has never existed either. That's never happened where they protected rights. But all of that is ultimately irrelevant. The point of the matter is, who made the stronger case for individual rights? Both Rand and Rothbard advocated for objective rights. Rothbard called it natural law, self-ownership. Rand called it individual rights. And I've made the case for why Rand was better, but you're taking me in 100 different directions that have nothing to do with the opening proposition. So, I mean, I want to keep the discussion going, but I'm just not interested in David Kelly or what he's done or whether objectivism's open or closed. I'm only interested in the proposition Ayn Rand is better than Rothbard on rights. So it's at 38:24. I'm going to turn it back over to you for your 5, and then I think we're going to have to maybe give our closing statements. We're 38 minutes in anyway. That'll put us close to an hour, unless the debate evolves and gets back to the core. If you've got a case to make against Rand's argument for ethics or for rights, but all this other stuff is just irrelevant to the case. Go ahead. It's 38:50 right now.
Okay. So maybe I was wrong on his Randian phase for creation or focusing on creation, but then he was wrong, period. That doesn't mean there are no objective rights. I don't know where you got this, that I don't believe in objective rights. Objective value is not objective rights. It's not the same. Austrians do not use the terms that way. They are actually more careful with the use of the terms. And I was just trying to comment on how law evolved historically and why some Randian fantasies don't apply in like even theoretically they are out of touch with history and with theory itself. That said, going back to the point, I think Ayn Rand is worse than Rothbard, or Rothbard is better than Rand on the defense of right, because, first of all, he's not a big proponent of intellectual property. And into 2025 and going forward, we can truly see, like in the internet and digital world, how intellectual property is distorting markets. It's censorship towards citizens. Governments all over the world, including here in Ecuador, have used intellectual property to censor citizens' critiques, literally, like copyrights over pictures and all these things, and they have destroyed lives, etc. So, how can Ayn Rand be better than Rothbard? Her student at some point, yes. When she advocates for censorship and basically it's intellectual property is a soft form of fascism with an entrepreneurial masquerade or etc. So let me give the microphone back to you. That's a question of mine. If you already advocate for the censorship of other people,
Okay.
and Rothbard has everything that you offer, and without all this crankiness and the cultism, etc., why not Rothbard? Rothbard is better than Rand.
Okay. So the first thing is, before we came on the air, I said, why don't we do this? And I said, we'll each speak for a given amount of time. And then I said to you, and then we can have an open dialogue. You said, no, you don't want to do the open dialogue.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Let's do the open dialogue. I'm so sorry. I didn't get that
But
part.
now you want to do the open dialogue. So what?
No, yes.
Okay.
My bad. I didn't hear that.
Okay. So you're just said to me, first of all, yes, Austrians, as they're defining value, they say value is subjective. They're referring to valuation on a market, except for Mises. Mises expanded it a little bit broader. Right is a moral term. It's dependent on an objective morality. The fundamental unit of morality is value, of ethics is value. If you don't have
scarcity. Michael, without scarcity, you wouldn't need law or economics as disciplines.
Juan, you told me earlier you didn't want to have this, but now you just interrupted me. So which way? I mean, I'm being respectful, but now you've interrupted.
No, I'm sorry. I said I'm sorry. But
okay.
It's a scarcity.
No, that's not what gives rise to ethics. Is not scarcity. It's simply not. But no, even if it did, it's irrelevant. If you don't have objective value, you don't have objective morality. If you don't have objective morality, you don't have objective rights. And for you to say, well, Rothbard's better at rights because he has a downstream conclusion about intellectual property, negates the entire argument that gets there. You would have to first show that Rothbard makes a better argument on rights, and that leads to his view on intellectual property. You're starting way downstream. Rothbard starts downstream from ethics at politics, and now you're starting way downstream from rights to a practical application as opposed in reference to one type of rights. So it's not following. If you think Rothbard is wrong about there being an objective morality, then how can you defend Rothbard on rights?
No, I don't think he's wrong on objective morality. I said he was wrong on the creation as basis of rights. I think it's a scarcity and first occupancy, and it's evolved. My point about evolution and all these judges systems and talking about the students of Rothbard is to make that whole case of how Rothbard is better on rights, and not only on rights as a demonstration. Everything that is good on Rand is already on Rothbard, minus the fascist censorship part of so-called intellectual property. He's more careful about war, issues of war. Ayn Rand was a bit bloodthirsty, not like Walter Block, but a bit bloodthirsty. And again, being more careful with natural rights in the case of wars and what is just war and all these things. This is objective morality towards rights. So in the sense that morality pertains rights, it's objective, but it's not objective in other subjects. It's you cannot have a whole system of morality for everyone that pretends to not be religious at the same time. It's impossible unless we're discussing basic applied ethics like legal, etc., etc., etc. You know what I mean? Like a cigarette is not going to be the symbol of morality and the thinking mind for everyone or whatever. So these are things that we need to separate. I know they're Randian conception, but Michael, everything that is good in Rand is already in Rothbard, or has okay, thanks to Rand because he was her student, and he took some things from her. But then he went back to the original authors. He, not only Rothbard but other Austrians have a deeper appreciation of Kant. Kant was not only what Ayn Rand said or whatever. So Rothbard went back to the books, to the original thinkers, and made a better synthesis. And that one, one that allows for Hoppe's contribution, for Kinsella's contributions, etc. They are relevant because Rothbard is not only Rothbard. Rothbard is this fundamental and open system that allows for a better defense of rights. So Ayn Rand is 50% good on rights. If you add IP and war, she's 50% bad. And the state, and the existence of a state, and the state has support rights. Maybe she's less than 50% great on rights. And she was great. And she was probably one of the best. Well, not probably, she was one of the best for her era. And she's still probably 50% statist and socialist and anti-rights or fascist with intellectual property. So, of course, Rothbard is better than Rand.
Okay. I'll give my closing statement and then you can give yours. My closing statement is you did not make an argument at all for Rothbard being superior to Rand at rights. You've taken Rothbardian conclusions as facts, such as that IP is bad and his views on war, without justifying them, which was my exact critique of Rothbard, is that he does not justify his positions. You've brought in smears about the cigarette and Rand being cranky. You've called Rand a socialist. You've called her whatever on IP, called her names. What you did not do was make an argument. At no point in the discussion did you actually make an argument for why Rothbard is superior to Rand on rights. In fact, what you said was there's no objective value. If there's no objective value, there's no objective morality. There's no objective morality. There's no objective rights. It's that simple. Right is a moral concept. Rothbard nowhere makes the argument for an objective morality. He doesn't even define morality. He doesn't define ethics. He doesn't define value. He jumps in at politics and does the lazy work of saying these concepts are self-evident without actually connecting them to reality. He then deduces his entire system. You've then taken that system and went to his downstream conclusions and said, aha, these are good. Sorry, my friend, you have to prove that. You can't just assert it. And with that, I will just thank Juan and thank the audience. And I will give Juan 5 minutes for a closing statement. And then we will say our goodbyes and say where you can find Juan. Go ahead, Juan.
Thank you. Well, I wasn't trying to smear Ayn Rand when they talk about the cigarette, but it's kind of a silly thing. That's not a smear, saying that some great thinker or writer said some silly things. Come on, we cannot be these religious about things. I am smearing the movement as religious, probably, yeah, but not Ayn Rand. She was so good in so many points or things. So about justifying positions, they have been justified. But for example, when Rothbard speaks of Aristotle and Aquinas, and he leads in abundant footnotes. You cannot blame Rothbard for that. You want everything spelled out. We don't have the time here to spell out the whole, the whole case, blah, 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 et cetera, as Aristotle or Aquinas would. Or, probably neither of us could write it in a book even. But the point is that you have all this pointing to all these authors. Probably, to be fair, Rothbard could have said on one of his footnotes, read Ayn Rand on this or that, but there are justifications for all these things. What I wanted to point out in general today is that rights have evolved. Scarcity is what leads to property. Right is a legal concept. It's a subset of morality, of course, but it's political and legal, or political legal. And it's based on scarcity. And of course, I believe in objective morality pertaining right, or because all rights are property rights, and scarcity is objective. So that's all you need, basically. And people have evolved these systems of property and conflict resolution, whether free judges or the monopoly of the state, which of course has destroyed the production of just law or rational law by any standards in every country. So all these things are connected, Michael. I'm sorry if I sounded too, going into different directions, but they are connected in my view. and they all justify the existence of rights. And Rothbard was a Mengerian, so the origin of institutions like property and all these things that have evolved in all parts of the world. Not every part of the world had a John Locke or a Jefferson or Ayn Rand explaining these things in a philosophical way. They just evolved because through reason, yes, reason evolved itself. We have discovered that property allows for better, peace, and it's fair. There's justice, and there's minimization of conflict. In other words, control over scarce resources. Of course, it's interesting that we began with this whole idea of talking today from two axioms, because in my understanding, it was Ayn Rand that had the self-property axiom, and then the Austrians had the action axiom, and they were separate, and we were trying to merge them in our minds. In the case of the students of both currents, or people that have been studying Ayn Rand and or Riesman, who merges both. But the basic fact here is that Rothbard made a better case for liberty overall. Historically, theoretically, he defended rights based on what they should be defended. Going back to, you don't see Ayn Rand, okay? You can say anything about Ayn Rand having a huge library, etc., but she didn't credit. She was like a little bit like Adam Smith, like. Yes, you can come up with some things as a communicator, etc. But you can also tell us you took this from there, etc. She wasn't not enough generous enough with footnotes, in my view. So you can go back always. You can go back to the traditions, and some of these traditions have merged historically, maybe causally or not, with religion. And lots of defenses of natural rights actually originally don't come from Ayn Rand. They come from Grotius and Pufendorf, or Aquinas, Aristotle, and people that were working some of them inside religion. So there are defenses of natural rights. Let's not pretend that Rothbard just threw the conclusion away. It's not like that. He's always explaining, even in the Ethics of Liberty, where he took these ideas from, etc., etc., in a way more careful way, which is also respectful of other people's, not rights, because I don't believe in intellectual property, but respectful of other people's and great thinkers in the past to actually credit them. So with that, I just want to thank you, Michael, for your time today. I'm sorry if we went in different directions.
Thank you, Juan.
My fault. And I just wanted to leave you with one idea. Markets are more reasonable than individuals, and markets and only hippies don't want to privatize one more thing or everything, and just markets do it better. If you want a rational order with a defense of rights, you cannot hand it over to a monopoly. Thank you.
Where can people find you, Juan?
They can find me on X. I am JF Carpio, or jfcarpio.com is my Substack or blog, JF Carpio.
All right. Thank you so much, Juan,
thank you,
for
Michael.
joining us. And audience, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And I will see you tomorrow at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Thank you very much.